Today we're going to be learning about how to evaluate inverse trig functions. In order to do this, we must have some basic knowledge of these vocab words. So cosine is the ratio equal to the adjacent side of the hypotenuse. Whenever we're talking about the adjacent or opposite sides, we're talking about them in relation to the angle theta. In this diagram, you're able to see this is the diagram while the hypotenuse is the longest side, and this is adjacent while this is the opposite side. So in cosine, this is the ratio of adjacent over hypotenuse. Our next vocab word is sine, and what this is the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse, and tangent is the ratio of the opposite side over the adjacent side. This brings us to our next vocab word, which is an inverse, and an inverse reverses a function and makes the output the input and the input the output. The inverse trig functions are functions used when given the side length of a triangle to find an angle measurement of a triangle. Now let's take a look at some examples. This first example is asking us to find the arcsine of 1/2. This is essentially asking us to find the inverse of sine, and this can also be described as sine to the power of -1, which implies that you're trying to find the inverse. To do this problem, we only really need a calculator, and keep in mind that we want to set our calculator in radians, and to do this we can just hit mode and check what mode it's in, and we can see it's already in radians. So we can go back to our calculator, and since we're trying to find the inverse of sine, you can hit second sine, which gets us sine to the -1, and we're trying to find of 1/2, which gets us 0.52359 radians. Then we can use our basic rounding rules to figure out that the answer is 0.52 radians. Now let's take a look at this next example where we're trying to find the arctangent of -1, or the inverse of tangent of -1. So let's look at a unit circle first to try and figure this one out. We know that this one will be a bit more complicated since we'll have to find the tangent of these two coordinates by dividing y by x or sine by cosine. So let's remember that the answer we will get for the tangent has to be negative, so the angle cannot be in the first or third quadrant. Now let's look at some of these coordinates for some of these. As you can see, the sine and cosine for 3 pi over 4 is negative square root over 2 and square root over 2, and if we divide these, we will get -1. And we know this because if you divide anything by itself, you get 1. And since there's a negative, you would get -1. So that's one of our answers, as well as 7 pi over 4, because sine and cosine divide to get -1 as well. So all in all, our two answers are 7 pi over 4, as well as 3 pi over 4. Now let's take a look at our third and last example. So this example is asking us to find the value without a calculator, which is sine -1 of cosine of 2 pi over 3. So once again, we're going to be looking at a unit circle, and let's try to find 2 pi over 3 on this diagram. So if we look at this unit circle, we know that 2 pi over 3 is right here. So we're looking for the cosine, and this will be the first value of this coordinate, which is -1/2. So let's plug that into our problem, and now we have sine of -1, -1/2. Let me write that out for you. Now let's look for an angle value on the unit circle that also has a second coordinate of -1/2. So it looks like there are two angle values that give us a value of -1/2, and they are 7 pi over 6 as well as 11 pi over 6. This will give our answer of 7 pi over 6 as well as 11 pi over 6.